Today, the 9th of Kislev, is the birthday and the yahrzeit of the Mitteler Rebbe. Rabbi Dov Ber, the son of the Alter Rebbe, the Baal Tanya, was born on this day and passed away on the same day. He was passed away as yahrzeit, as his birthday. And although the Gemara says that Kadosh Baruch Hu memalish nesim shel tzadikim miyoyim liyoyim, that it's a thing that God allows a tzaddik to not have a wasted year or day, so that a person dies on their birthday, but we only see it by very few of our actual tzaddikim in our history that it actually happened that they died on their birthday. Moshe Rabbeinu, of course, on the 7th of Adar, and the 9th of Kislev is the birthday and the yahrzeit of the Mitteler Rebbe. And there's a lot that could be said about the Mitteler Rebbe, but just to say in a moment, the Mitteler Rebbe, his whole being was Chassidus. His whole being was to teach Chassidic philosophy. He was completely enraptured with Chassidic philosophy, and he wanted everyone to be. His son-in-law, the Tzemach Tzedek, said about him that if you would have cut my father-in-law's finger, blood wouldn't have come out, Chassidus would have come out. And Chassidus, of course, we know is divine consciousness. What's Chassidus? Chassidus is everyone that the Baal Shem Tov brought to the world, the idea that everyone, even a simple wagon driver, could be with God's immanence all the time, because God is in all things and moves through all things. And so consciousness of that and understanding of how that is, consciousness of that is the emunah, is the faith of the Baal Shem Tov, that living with divine oneness and consciousness. But understanding it is Chassidus Chabad, is what the Mitteler Rebbe was all about. And the Mitteler Rebbe once said that if one were to ask him, what is his ultimate wish? What would be for him a sign of success? That he was successful in his job as being a Rebbe, as being a leader of the Jewish people. So the Mitteler Rebbe said it would be that when two Chassidim meet in the street, they talk about Yechudi Ilah. They talk about the supernal unity of God, the consciousness of God's unity on the supernal level. That's what two businessmen, two people on the street, when they meet, two Chassidim, that's what they should be speaking about. Now we understand that that's because the Mitteler Rebbe wanted that Chassidus, that Chassidic philosophy shouldn't just be ideas, but should be a way of life, that we should internalize it to the way that it should be our blood, just like it was his. And he specifically was saying that what aspect of divine consciousness of Chassidus, of living with the pervasiveness of God, what he wanted, as Chassidim would speak about all the time, Yechudi Ilah, the supernal level of God's unity. The Mitteler Rebbe wanted that we should all be living all the time with Yechudi Ilah, the supernal level of God's unity. Now, obviously, that means there's a Yechud Tata. There's a lower level of God's unity, but just in a moment, what is Yechudi Ilah, the supernal level of God's unity, is what's today called by scholars of religion and philosophy panentheism. That all is in God and everything is within God. That everything that exists is extensions and manifestations and emanations of God's light, which are still within Hashem all the time. We're within God. Yechudi Ilah means to be able to know and meditate and live with that we're always with Hashem. We're living with God, within God all the time. And I think to really understand what the Mitteler Rebbe wants from us, there's a very distinct parallel, I believe. The Chassidic idea of Yechudi Ilah, which is really the idea of Ein Od Milvado, that nothing exists other than God, because of all of reality is within Hashem. All of reality is an aspect of divinity, is a ray of Hashem's light that's within God. That idea, that simcha, that joy of Yechudi Ilah, of being within God all the time, is essentially what the philosophy of Spinoza is all about. Now, the connection of Spinoza to Chassidus has been discussed since the time of the Mitteler Rebbe. I mean, there were people, the famous early work about Chabad philosophy by Moshe Teitelbaum, Rabbi Miliadivich Mifleget Chabad, He already equates the Alter Rebbe with Spinoza. Spinoza, of course, is known for pantheism, that the world is God. But of course, as contemporary scholars have been discussing for the past couple of decades, really something that the Jewish philosopher Salman Maimon was the first one to speak about in his autobiography, and was then appropriated by Hegel and then the German Romantics, is that one that reads Spinoza as being atheistic, pantheistic, like the way that the scientific world took Spinoza, the atheists used Spinoza, is a total misreading of Spinoza. If one reads Spinoza properly, Spinoza was not saying pantheism, he was saying panentheism. That's what his philosophy is saying, is panentheism. Spinoza taught that all of reality is an aspect, is an extension, is a mode of God. God is God is a simple substance with an infinite amount of modes. And the modes of God that we experience are extension, physicality, physical universe, and thought, the realm of our thought. Those are aspect modes of God's being. But God is infinitely beyond that, Spinoza says as well. So therefore, panentheism were aspects within God. Parenthetically, as I explained at length in a different class, the one on Halachic Man about Spinoza, in Chabad Hasidic philosophy, what Spinoza is talking about is what's called in Chassidus, based on the writings of earlier Kabbalists, Sphiros Ein Ketz. An aspect of Or Ein Sof before Tzimtzum, of God's infinite light before the Tzimtzum, is called Sphiros Ein Ketz, infinite modes of God. But of course, we believe, Chassidus explains that there are levels even beyond that, which is, by the way, what Rav Kook writes in a famous letter that's printed in Lenevuche Hador. Rav Kook writes that really Spinoza was saying the same thing as the Baal Shem Tov. He just didn't have the language. The language wasn't revealed yet. The Baal Shem Tov and then the Baal Shem Tov's main student, the Maggid of Mezrich, and then the Alter Rebbe, the main student of the Maggid of Mezrich, and then Mitteler Rebbe, who's named after the Reb Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezrich, and all the Chabad Rebbeim after that are essentially explaining what Spinoza wasn't able to explain within the language of Judaism, because Hasidus wasn't revealed yet. And again, the truth is, the caricature God that the atheists make fun of, the man in the sky with the white beard, that kind of dualism that Spinoza was rejecting, which seems to be present in our Bible and in our Gemara, when we speak about God as this king, otherly, father, with this anthropomorphic speech, that's what the Bible and our Gemara seem to say. But one that learns Chassidus and Kabbalah and understands the Pnimis Torah, the inner meaning of that language, that's all manifestations, again, modes and extensions of Or Ein Sof. But Or Ein Sof infinitely transcends, is Soiv Kol Alman, and infinitely transcends even any aspect of infinite light. So Spinoza was just really saying the Baal Shem Tov. And if one is to learn, of course, Spinoza's most famous book is the Ethics of Spinoza, which is a fascinating work. Essentially, it's almost trying to use the most, at that time, scientific terminology, which was Euclidean geometry, like almost using propositions and sequences and proofs, etc. Like, he built out a way of understanding God's unity. And then at the very end of the book, because ethics, Spinoza's book is not just a book of metaphysics or theology or philosophy of God. Spinoza's book was written, it's called Ethics. It has a specific purpose, and that is to allow a person to achieve the ultimate happiness that one can in life. What Spinoza calls blessedness. Blessedness. The very end of Ethics, the very end of the book, Spinoza defines what blessedness is. And the whole book is really written just so that one should be able to contemplate how to achieve that blessedness. That's what Spinoza's philosophy is. What is the blessedness Spinoza speaks about? So, first of all, it's to be freed, to be redeemed from the bondage of our own passions, of our own desires. Just like in Buddhism, the Buddha said all suffering comes from desire, from our desire, our wanting specific things. And it's been discussed, the connection of Spinoza to Buddha as well. And we understand that therefore a person that has desires is going to be want to suffer if one doesn't have that. So the first thing is, if one's desires are not fulfilled, and all one's desires are never fulfilled. Our sages teach us, Chazal say, a person doesn't die with having even achieved half of what you desire in life. We only achieve half of our desires in life, no matter how much we try. There's always more to desire. So as long as one is ruled by those passions, one can't be happy if that becomes what my happiness is based on, achieving those passions. And in fact, the fourth section of the Ethics, which really conveys this idea, the title of the fourth section, the section of the Ethics, is Of Human Bondage, or the Strength of the Emotions. Of Human Bondage, which is the source of the title of the novel of the same name. Of human bondage, that human bondage is being a slave to one's passions, to one's own desires, because the only way to achieve blessedness and happiness in Spinoza's thought, and in Tanya chapter 33 that teaches the faith of the Baal Shem Tov, which is Yichudi Ilah, the supernal union of God, Spinoza explains the only way to achieve that state of blessedness is to be able to come to a place where one is able to rest and be at peace with what is always able to be achieved, meaning it has to be internal, because if it's something dependent on something external, one can't always be in a state of blessedness, which is why if one happiness is based on desire, it can't be continuous, and it's, based on the vicissitudes of life, whether one is able to fulfill that, and generally one can't, as we said. So it has to be something that, and again, we understand our happiness isn't based on what's going on in our external circumstances. One could be in a vacation, a beautiful, hotel in the Bahamas, and has a storm inside one's head. One is sad. No matter how beautiful and expensive everything is, it's useless. And on the other hand, if one, as Lubavitcher Rebbe once said, that there were Jews that experienced true inner freedom in a concentration camp. That in a concentration camp, they were able to live with true freedom, inner freedom. Because that inner freedom can't be taken away, because it's within oneself. It's coming to happiness that's within oneself, which is the idea ultimately of Nirvana, of Buddhism. And Spinoza calls it blessedness. So I'm just going to read a little, at the very end, the very last, almost the last paragraph of the Ethics. He said, blessedness consists in love towards God, which love springs from the knowledge of God. Therefore, this love must be referred to the mind. In proportion as the mind rejoices more in this divine love or blessedness, so much he has the power over his emotions, and so much the less is he subject to the emotions which are evil. And therefore, Spinoza really says that, as opposed to the general belief of the multitude that people seem to think that a person that's truly free as one could fulfill all one's lusts, it's the opposite. He says in the famous quote, which is the last proposition in the book, blessedness is not the reward of virtue, but virtue itself. Neither do we rejoice therein because we control our lusts, but contrary, because we rejoice therein, we are able to control our lusts, which means as follows. As the Alter Rebbe really says in chapter 33 of Tanya, because what Spinoza had explained, that the road to this knowledge of God, this love of God, comes from the knowledge of God, and the knowledge of God is to know that one is always within God, which is what Tanya chapter 33 is all about, which is what the Emunah of the Baal Shem Tov is all about. So what Spinoza is explaining is really parallel to chapter 33 of Tanya, and it's up to people wiser than myself to discuss how much the Alter Rebbe, whether he was familiar with Spinoza or not, but the whole point of the book is this, to dwell in this blessedness. And as the Alter Rebbe says there in chapter 33 of Tanya, that this dwelling in God, this becoming intoxicated in God, this having this constant consciousness of God, is not for something else. It's not in order to achieve something else. It is the ultimate dwelling with God. It is the ultimate purpose of existence, as he explains there in chapter 33 of Tanya. Living with God in such a way that one doesn't need anything external, but rather to be able to rest in the ground of being, to feel God as the all, to know that one is always within God, that closeness of God. And so, in the words of Spinoza, blessedness is not the reward of virtue, but virtue itself. This blessedness, this dveikus, this being able to be at rest within God, is not the reward of virtue. It's not that like I do mitzvahs to be able to get here. I don't do things to get to this state. It is what I want to be. It is the state. I'm not having the state in order to do something else, in order to be able to fulfill something else. Even though the Alter Rebbe does say there in Tanya chapter 33 that through this emunah one comes to do mitzvahs, but even without that, it is virtue itself. It is real being. And as Chassidus really talks about, that one might think that one needs to control one's lusts to be able to achieve connection to God, Chassidus said the exact opposite. And that's why Chassidus was really bringing God intoxication to every person, because Chassidus taught that it's not that you control your lusts in order to be able to dwell within God and have God consciousness, but it's rather that one is able to come to dwell and have happiness and bliss and God consciousness in the ground of being, in just being itself and feeling oneself within God. That is how one controls one's lusts. That is, as he says there in Tanya chapter 33. And so, Spinoza for many years was seen as being a pantheist and an atheist, but as we've been learning, Spinoza was a panentheist. And the German romantics, especially Novalis, they really built on this idea of the world of nature as being a way of appreciating God. Nature is a way that God reveals himself, which is what Hasidism is all about. And so Novalis called Spinoza a God-intoxicated man, a person that his whole being is to be able to dwell in that truth of God. In the language of Hasidus, it's called meditating on God's unity, his beinunus ba'achdus Hashem. Or in the language of the Mitteler Rebbe, walking down the street and speaking of Yichudi Ilah, living with the divine consciousness of the supernal unity that we're always within God. The Mitteler Rebbe wanted the ultimate goal of Chassidus. And as Spinoza finishes off his book by saying it's not easy to achieve. It's not easy to achieve at all. He says very beautifully, the very last sentence of the book is that all things excellent are as difficult as they are rare. So this dveikus of the Baal Shem Tov, which is the beginning, the first step in serving God according to Chassidus, the middle step of serving God, and the ultimate level of serving God, and ultimately is what Mashiach is about, which is why the Lubavitcher of our generation once said that he hopes that his Chassidim, when they meet in the street, talk about Mashiach. And Mashiach, the Messianic redemption, of course, means how we could bring goodness to the world, even in the dark times we're living in now, and somehow, even in the world that we're living in, to be able to feel God in all things and reveal God in all things. That's what Mashiach is. That's that supernal consciousness. When Mashiach comes, we're going to see the truth of Yichudi Ilah. We're going to see that all things are in God and move in God. That God is closer to us than our very breath. That our very breath is an aspect of God's infinity that's within God's infinity right now. And the blessedness, or in the language of the Alter Rebbe in chapter 33 of Tanya, the dveikus, the simcha of that dveikus, which parenthetically is really essentially what the whole book, The Power of Now, is about. The whole point of the book, The Power of Now, is essentially the main idea of Buddhism, to be able to be redeemed, freedom from trying to achieve anything than being within oneself and knowing that oneself is within God, and that every here and now is an extension, a mode of God's being. And so one is always able to dwell in that dveikus and that achdus, that simcha, that blessedness. That's Mashiach. The more that we live with that and we learn with that and we teach that and we help others meditate on that, that is Mashiach. And so the Rebbe wanted that we all, as we go through life, should be shluchim, should be messengers of God to bring the truth of this blessedness to all people, even though It's difficult. All things excellent are difficult as they are rare. But this is the Emunah that the Baal Shem Tov, the light of the Baal Shem Tov, that will bring to the world Mashiach, which is really the only way that will have this simcha, this blessedness for all people, all time, which is why Mashiach is the same letters as Yismach, that we will be happy then. We should see it today.